This is the story of Thomas Elliott Bauer and his wife Emily Renee Calloway Bauer. They met at a fundraiser for a children's literacy program, which was, in retrospect, the most honest thing about their relationship. Thomas was there because he believed in the cause. Emily was there because she believed in being seen at the right places. For 3 years, they circled each other in that particular way people do when they're looking for something they can't quite name. Comfort, perhaps, or the feeling of being chosen. What they built together was real, in the way that a house built on slightly uneven ground is real, livable, beautiful even, until the season changes and the doors stop closing right. The story of their unraveling is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about the slow, almost imperceptible way that two people can share a bed, a bank account, a future, and still remain, fundamentally, strangers to each other. The alarm went off at 6:45, and Thomas was already awake. He'd been lying on his back in the gray pre-dawn light, staring at the ceiling the way he'd started doing more mornings than not. Not anxiously, just quietly. The way a person looks at something familiar, they're no longer certain they understand. Emily slept on her side facing the window, her breathing even, one hand tucked under her cheek. He watched the rise and fall of her shoulder and felt, as he sometimes did, a tenderness so close to sadness that he couldn't tell them apart. He got up without waking her. That was a habit too. Downstairs, the kitchen was still dim. Thomas started the coffee and stood at the sink looking out at the backyard. The garden Emily had planted 2 springs ago and largely abandoned. The back fence that needed repainting, the oak tree that had been there since before either of them. There was a quality to early mornings that he'd always loved, a sense of the day being unwritten. Lately, though, the mornings felt less like possibility and more like postponement. He heard her on the stairs before he saw her. The specific rhythm of Emily's step, confident and purposeful, even half asleep. She came into the kitchen already scrolling through her phone, wearing the silk robe he bought her for Christmas, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was objectively beautiful. He still noticed it. He just wasn't sure anymore what he did with that noticing. "Morning," she said, not looking up. "Coffee's almost done." She made a sound of acknowledgement and settled at the kitchen island, her phone propped against the fruit bowl. Thomas poured 2 cups and set hers beside her without comment. This too was habit, a choreography they developed so slowly neither of them had noticed it becoming choreography. They'd been together 4 years, engaged for 7 months. The wedding was 14 weeks away, a Saturday in early October at Halcyon House, a converted estate 40 minutes outside the city. Emily had chosen it from a short list of venues she'd assembled in a spreadsheet organized by aesthetic, cost, and a column Thomas had noticed but never mentioned: perceived prestige. It was a beautiful place. He'd agreed to it readily, partly because he trusted her eye for these things, and partly because the choosing had seemed to matter so much more to her than it did to him. His family had been asking about the details for months. His mother, Carol, called every few weeks with gentle questions, not intrusive, just interested. His younger sister, Diane, had already bought a dress. His father, Ray, had quietly set aside money for the rehearsal dinner. Thomas had grown up in a family that was not wealthy but was demonstratively warm, the kind that showed up to things and remembered anniversaries and cried openly at weddings. He'd assumed, without examining the assumption, that Emily understood this about him, that his family was not background noise but a central fact of who he was. The first time she'd mentioned the guest list concerns, he hadn't registered it as a warning. They'd been reviewing seating arrangements at the dining room table, Emily with her color-coded chart, Thomas with a highlighter he kept forgetting to use. She looked up from the paper and said, almost offhandedly, "I've been thinking about the balance between our sides, the optics of it." "What optics?" he'd asked. "Just the way it looks. On your side, there are a lot of people who are," she'd paused, chosen the next word carefully, "casual." He'd thought she meant the number of cousins, the kids, the general sprawl of a large Midwestern family. He'd said something mild and agreeable and turned back to the seating chart. Emily had not pressed it further. That evening, he'd called his sister to talk about something else entirely. a problem at work, a car that needed servicing, and Diane had asked, near the end of the conversation, whether she should bring her boyfriend or list him as a plus one. Thomas had said he'd double check and told her not to worry. She'd laughed and said she wasn't worried at all. He hadn't told her, then, that a faint and sourceless unease had settled somewhere behind his sternum. He wouldn't have known how to name it. He filed it, the way he filed most things that didn't yet make sense, under wait and see. He was still waiting. The conversation happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the engagement photos were due to be submitted to the venue's promotional registry. Another detail Emily had arranged without discussing. Another thing Thomas had discovered by reading an email over her shoulder. They were in the living room after dinner. Emily was on the couch with her laptop, a glass of wine on the end table, working through what she called vendor follow-ups. Thomas sat across from her in the armchair he'd had since before they met, a worn leather thing she'd twice suggested replacing, that he twice quietly declined to replace. He was reading or trying to. He kept reading the same paragraph. "I finalized the ceremony seating today," Emily said without looking up. "Okay, I sent the updated chart to the coordinator." Thomas set his book down. "Can I see it?" She turned the laptop toward him. He leaned forward and looked at the arrangement, the neat rows, the table assignments, the color-coded distinction between her side and his. He scanned it twice before he understood what he was seeing. His parents were not on it. His sister was not on it. The entirety of his family, aunts, cousins, his childhood best friend Marcus, who'd driven 300 miles to attend, had been replaced by names he recognized as Emily's colleagues. Her gym friends, 2 women from her book club he'd met exactly once. He sat with that for a moment. "Where's my family?" he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Emily closed the laptop slightly, a gesture he recognized as the prelude to a prepared explanation. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that," she said. "I've made some decisions about the guest configuration." Configuration, the word landed strangely. "Emily, the venue has a specific aesthetic. The coordinator and I talked about it. There's a certain visual coherence we're going for in the photos, in the whole presentation. Your family is lovely, but..." She stopped. "It's a lot of people, and they're very present. They're my family." "I know." Diane bought a dress. Something moved across Emily's face. Not guilt exactly, more like the flicker of a person recalculating. "She can keep the dress. There will be other occasions." Thomas stood up. Not dramatically. He just found he couldn't keep sitting. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking at the street below. The amber wash of the streetlights, a neighbor walking a dog, ordinary things happening at an ordinary hour, wholly indifferent to what was occurring inside this apartment. "When were you going to tell me?" he said. "I'm telling you now." "You sent it to the coordinator first." She didn't answer that directly. She said instead, "I need this day to be a certain thing, Thomas. I need it to represent us a specific way. Is that so difficult to understand?" He turned around. "What way? What specifically are you afraid it won't represent?" And here she did something that would stay with him for a long time afterward. She looked at him, then looked past him at some middle distance, and said, and he was almost certain she didn't mean to say it out loud, that it was something she'd been thinking, and it simply escaped, "I just need everything to look the way it's supposed to look. Not us, not our wedding, everything." He thought about that word for the rest of the night. He thought about it while she explained, in measured tones, about venue aesthetics and photography and the importance of curation. He thought about it while he agreed to sleep on it, which was something he said to avoid continuing a conversation he didn't yet have the language for. He lay in the dark afterward and stared at the ceiling. And then, in the particular silence of the room, he said, not loudly, not to Emily, who was already asleep, "I don't know. Maybe someone out there gets it." He paused in the dark, and something in his expression shifted, like a man who has briefly glimpsed an audience he wasn't expecting. Or, I don't know, like this story, or subscribe, or something. A beat, Emily stirred. What? Nothing, he said. Go back to sleep. She did. He didn't call Marcus until morning, but when he did, the first thing he said wasn't about the guest list. The first thing he said was, I think I've been missing something for a long time. Marcus, to his credit, didn't ask what. He just said, Yeah, I know. Marcus had known Thomas since they were 11 years old, which meant he knew how Thomas went quiet before he'd arrived at something real. It wasn't sulking. It was a kind of internal processing that the people who loved Thomas had learned to recognize and not interrupt. By the time Thomas called, Marcus understood that the quiet had run its course. They met for lunch at a diner near Thomas's office, a place with vinyl booth seats and coffee that came in 2 large mugs, and nobody paid any attention to anyone else. Thomas told him the whole thing plainly, without editorializing. The guest list, the chart, the word configuration, the phrase, look the way it's supposed to look. Marcus listened. He ate half his sandwich before he said anything. Has she given you a reason? A real one? Aesthetic coherence, Thomas said. That's not a reason. That's a sentence arranged to sound like one. Thomas looked down at his coffee. She's been doing that a lot lately, saying things that sound complete and aren't. What does your gut say? My gut says there's something she doesn't want my family to know. He'd said it out loud for the first time, and the saying of it made it more solid, more real. He watched the words settle between them on the table and knew, with the particular clarity that comes after a long period of willful uncertainty, that he'd been circling this conclusion for weeks. That evening, he came home and asked Emily to sit down. She looked up from her laptop and something in his expression made her close it fully this time, without being asked. I need you to tell me what's actually happening, he said. She opened her mouth. Not the aesthetic reason, he said. Not the venue's visual language. What is actually happening? A long pause. She looked at her hands. She was, he realized, genuinely afraid. And that fear was the most honest thing she'd shown him in months, maybe longer. Your family asks questions, she said finally. That's what families do, not like that. Your mother. She stopped. Your father asked me, at Christmas, what our financial plan looked like, whether we'd talked about savings, debt, where we were starting from. He was being, I know what he was being. Her voice was steady but thin. He was being caring. I know that, but I couldn't answer him, Thomas. Thomas was quiet. Why couldn't you answer him? She pressed her lips together. Then, because the answer wasn't what you think it is. What followed took 40 minutes. It came out not in confession, but in fragments, pieces of a picture she'd been constructing around him without his knowledge. The credit cards, opened during the period when she'd been between jobs and too proud to say so. The line of personal debt she'd been servicing in silence, rerouting money to cover minimums while maintaining the surface of a shared financial life. Not fraud, not malice, something more mundane and more devastating. Shame compounded by time. By the time she was done, she wasn't crying. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table like someone awaiting a verdict. Thomas didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He sat in his chair and looked at the woman he'd agreed to marry and thought, with a terrible clarity, about all the conversations they'd never had. Not because they'd fought about them, but because she'd engineered their absence. You were going to let my family sit outside our wedding, he said, so they couldn't ask a question you'd already decided not to answer. She didn't deny it. The venue was your idea, he said. The guest list, all of it. You built the whole thing around a secret. I was going to tell you, she said. After, when we were settled. He looked at her for a long moment. When we were legally bound, she flinched. I know it's not what you intended, he said. I believe that. I don't think you're a bad person, Emily. I think you've been so afraid for so long that you've made decisions that made sense to the person you were afraid to be. She looked up at him. And I think, he said, I've been so afraid of looking too closely that I let you. He stood up, not in anger, but with the careful movements of someone who has made a decision and is being precise about it. He went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called the venue. He told them there had been a change. The weeks that followed had a quality Thomas could only describe later as underwater. Everything slowed and pressured and faintly distorted. He'd canceled the venue booking. He hadn't told Emily. It wasn't an act of revenge, though he would spend a long time examining that. It was something closer to an instinct, the feeling that if the event continued, something important would be buried beneath the photographs and the toasts and the forward momentum of a life they'd half constructed on uncertain ground. He needed the machinery to stop, and stopping it quietly without announcement was the only version he could manage. He'd moved into Marcus's spare room 6 days after the conversation. He and Emily were not technically broken up. He'd told her he needed time to think, which was true, and she'd received this with a stillness that he recognized as her own form of processing. She didn't argue, she didn't call every day. She sent occasional texts, careful, measured, the kind of messages that left space for a response without demanding one. He replied, sometimes. The wedding date arrived on a Saturday in early October, 41 degrees and clear. He was at Marcus's kitchen table when the first call came in. One of Emily's colleagues, confused, getting a voicemail from the venue about a cancellation. Then his mother, alarmed, having driven 40 minutes to find the gates of Halcyon House closed. Then Diane, who'd arrived with her boyfriend and found 12 other cars idling in the parking lot of a venue that had no record of an event that day. He told his family, quietly, not to go. He'd called each of them in the days prior, explained only that the wedding had been postponed, that he'd tell them more when he could. His mother had asked 3 questions, received 3 incomplete answers, and known better than to push. Emily's side had not been warned. He did not feel triumphant about this. He'd thought, perhaps, that he would, that some cold satisfaction would accompany the collapse of the careful architecture she'd built. Instead, he felt only a dull sorrow, the kind that comes not from what people do to each other, but from what they fail to do, and for how long and how quietly. Emily called at 11:47. He let it ring. She left a voicemail that was 22 seconds long, and her voice in it was not angry, but was something worse. Composed, in the way of a person composing themselves at the edge of something they cannot afford to fall into. She said, "I'd like to talk when you're ready. There are things I should have said a long time ago." He listened to it 3 times. He didn't call back that day. What he did in the weeks that followed was something he hadn't expected. He grieved, not loudly and not in a way that anyone outside his small circle of family and Marcus would have recognized his grief, but genuinely and fully. He grieved the relationship he believed he was in. He grieved the version of Emily he'd fallen in love with. Not because she hadn't been real, but because she had, and the real Emily had been so afraid that she'd made herself into someone he couldn't reach. He grieved, too, his own participation, his willingness to accept incomplete answers, his habit of filing unease under wait and see. He started therapy in November. The therapist was a quiet man in his 60s who had a habit of letting silences extend past the point of comfort. In their 4th session, Thomas said, "I keep wondering if I missed something, some obvious signal." The therapist said, "What would you have done with it if you'd seen it?" Thomas sat with that for a long time. "I don't know," he finally said. "Probably the same thing." Why? Because I wanted to believe the version that didn't require me to act. Across the city in the apartment they'd shared, Emily was doing her own reconstruction. She told people, carefully, selectively, that the wedding had been postponed due to a family situation on Thomas's side. She said this not with cruelty, but with the fluency of someone who has spent a long time managing the story of herself. Her colleagues accepted this. Her book club offered sympathy. Her mother, calling from Phoenix, received a slightly different version, one in which Thomas had gotten cold feet, which was not entirely false in the way Emily told it. She believed in those months that she could still fix it. She believed this with the specific conviction of someone who has always been able to recalibrate, to reframe, to find the angle from which a bad situation becomes a manageable one. She sent Thomas 2 emails, long ones, honest in ways she'd rarely allowed herself to be, and received brief, considered replies that were kind and said very little. She told herself it was progress. She reorganized the apartment. She hired a financial advisor, disclosed everything, began the process of actually addressing the debt rather than managing its appearance. This was harder than she expected and more clarifying. The advisor, a practical woman named Sandra, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, had looked at the numbers without expression and said, "Okay, here's where we actually are." Emily had cried in that office, which surprised her. Sandra had handed her a tissue and waited. "I built everything around not having to say that," Emily said. Sandra had nodded. "Most people do," she said. "Then the structure gets too complicated to maintain." They met in March, 5 months after the October that had ceased to be their wedding day. Thomas had suggested it. An email, plain and without elaboration, asking if she'd meet him for coffee. She'd replied within an hour. They chose a cafe neither of them had been to before, a neutral geography, a place with no history between them. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with her coat still on, her hands around a cup of something. She looked, he thought, like herself, not a diminished version, not someone who'd been undone. Whatever she'd been through in the intervening months, she'd passed through it and come out still upright. He respected that, even now. He sat across from her. He ordered coffee. The first few minutes were careful. "You look well," she said. "So do you." A pause. The cafe around them moved at its ordinary pace. An espresso machine, a baby in a stroller near the window, two men at laptops ignoring each other. "I got your emails," he said. "I know," you replied. "I know what I said in them." She smiled, briefly, without brightness. "You were very kind, in a way that made it clear where things were." He didn't refute this. "I want you to know," she said, "that she stopped, rearranged. "I've been doing the actual work, not the surface version, the financial stuff. All of it. I believe you. I'm not saying it so you'll." Another stop. "I'm saying it because you should know. Because I owe you the real version of things, even if it's past due." He nodded. He held his coffee cup with both hands. "I owe you something too," he said. She looked at him. "I made it easier for you not to tell me," he said. "I didn't ask questions I probably already knew the answers to, because I didn't want to have to do anything with the answers. That's not innocent. You were trusting me. I was trusting the story," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at the table. Something moved through her expression. Not grief exactly, more like the recognition of a thing that has been true for a long time and is only now being said. "Do you think," she said carefully, "that we ever really—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Yes," he said. "I do. That's the hard part." They sat with that for a while. Outside the window, March was doing what March does. Indeterminate, neither winter nor spring, the kind of day that doesn't commit to being anything. "I keep thinking about the fundraiser," Thomas said, "where we met, the literacy thing." "Yeah." He looked up. "You were wearing a green dress. You were talking to someone you clearly didn't want to be talking to, and every few seconds you'd look at the door." She remembered this. She was quiet. "I thought you were looking for someone more interesting," he said. "Later you told me you were looking for the bar." He almost smiled. "I was relieved. I thought it meant you were like me." "I was," she said, "in some ways." "I know." The coffee had gone only half drunk. Around them, the cafe continued being ordinary, transient, and indifferent and fully alive. A couple left with a stroller. The espresso machine hissed. Someone laughed at something on a phone. "What happens now?" Emily asked. Her voice was even, not pleading. Thomas looked at her. This person he'd loved, whom he still, in some excavated and complicated way, loved, and thought about all the questions he hadn't asked, and all the answers she hadn't offered, and the long architecture of silence they built between them, one careful evasion at a time. "I think," he said slowly, We've spent a lot of time around each other without actually being with each other. And I don't think we know how to fix that. I don't think that's something that can be fixed from where we are. She didn't argue. That, he thought, was its own kind of answer. He paid for both coffees. They walked outside together and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, slightly awkward in the way of people who no longer have a script. Take care of yourself, he said. You too. She walked left. He walked right. He didn't look back, not because he was being deliberate about it, but because he found, in that moment, that he simply didn't. He walked the 2 blocks to his car, got in, sat for a moment in the quiet. Outside, the city continued. A bus passed. A light changed. Someone somewhere was, in all probability, at a fundraiser they didn't quite want to be at, wearing a green dress, looking for the bar. He started the car. He thought about something his therapist had said 2 sessions ago. The opposite of connection isn't conflict. It's the careful maintenance of distance. He'd written it down when he got home. He still wasn't sure he understood it entirely. He thought, driving home on an ordinary March afternoon, that maybe understanding it was the work. Not a destination, just a direction, a thing to move toward, a question you keep asking until you're better at asking it. He turned on the radio. He drove. What they'd lost was not each other, exactly. It was the version of themselves that might have been honest enough to find each other. That version had existed, briefly, possibly, at a fundraiser years ago, in the space before the story began. The loss of it was quiet and real and would not arrive all at once. It would arrive in small moments, for years. The way most true losses do, not as an event, but as a season,